Yeah.
And so, did you notice that growing up, just even a few miles north, the culture could change?
In Eunice, you would find that we'd have to drive through Turkey Creek on the way to Alexandria, and when you stopped at the gas station, it kind of surprised you. Oh, they talk different up here, and by the time you're in high school, you hear the little jokes like the differences between Pine Prairie and Turkey Creek. Boom, you've hit North Louisiana in our book. Yeah, so that difference was kind of palpable. And I teach at Nicholls, and so I often I introduce myself to them, and I have to define the Cajun Triangle to them. I remind them that Thibodaux is in part of that triangle, and so is Lake Charles. But the top goes almost to Alexandria, like Marksville is usually what I say is up there. That's real still Cajun Triangle, and there's some people above I-10 that are definitely Cajun, because my classroom is full of Terrebonne and Lafourche people, and they think that same thing. Above I-10 must be not Cajun.
Right.
That's okay. That just means they didn't visit there yet.
Right.
I get that.
Bonjour et bienvenue à Louisiane, the only podcast 100% dedicated to Louisiana culture, communities, and our heritage French language. On Louisiane, we interview native speakers of Louisiana French and Creole, as well as culture bearers, including chefs, musicians, dancers, Mardi Gras practitioners, fishermen, artisans, and more. We need your support to keep our fight alive for Louisiana language and culture. Please support our show by going to louisiane.org and becoming a paying subscriber. Merci beaucoup et lâche pas.
Dr. Gary LaFleur, welcome to La Louisiane, our new podcast about all things Louisiana.
It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. And so, to get started, we love to talk about people's origin story and what makes them who they are. And so, can you tell us a little bit about where you're from and growing up?
Well, I grew up in Eunice, and my LaFleurs are from around Prairie Ronde. So, Eunice is not exactly Prairie Ronde, but that means that I grew up around a bunch of LaFleurs. And compared to some of the other prairie towns, Eunice was a little bit progressive. It was kind of a new town compared to some of the older towns like Acadiana. And so, weirdly, we're mostly talking about French restoration, French preservation here. But my mom and dad, they're about 85 now. They wanted to be more American, like Elvis, right? That was cool to them. So I can remember my mom saying, "Oh, we wanted to have a rock band at our wedding." That was in 1962. But my parents made me we had a Cajun band. My dad said we had to, so Dennis McGee and Sadie, Mr. Sadie Corville, and now they're like the big stars of Cajun heritage, and it's kind of cute. Well, so that's me growing up in Eunice, and I kind of had I was interested in marine biology. In my day, on Saturday mornings, we watched Sea Lab 2020. That was before Adult Swim. Sea Lab 2020 was the real thing, and I was really interested in that. And I did my education for about 15 years, leaving Louisiana. I was in Texas for a little while, and then Florida, and then Rhode Island. So by the time I saw the job available in Nicholls and Thibodaux, I was real happy to come back to Louisiana. I don't know if that's my origin story, but that's sort of how I got back here.
That's very succinct, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I would ask you, before you moved here to Thibodaux for your job, growing up on the prairie, did you ever spend much time around the coast? Or what was your experience?
Yeah, in Eunice, when you go to the coast, we would go to Holly Beach, and we would do some some crabbing and stuff. But it was pretty rare to do that. And I went to LSUE for 2 years. So it was at LSUE, it's kind of weird in high school. In high school, I was at St. Ed's, and we didn't like the Ville Platte people, right? They were like our enemies. But at LSUE, all of a sudden, you're in class with the folks from Crowley and Ville Platte and Opelousas, and, I fell in love. Those people were just like me, really, and so I got to be real good friends with a larger group of people. And it was right around that time when I first went to Fred's and Mammut, right? I was at LSUE, so that's right when I was about 18 to 19. And it was on a New Year's Day. and growing up, my grandparents talked French, so that was very familiar to me, but I didn't speak French. So I kind of missed out on that. I knew a few sentences, but I still could tell that Cajun music was special. And so I went to Fred's and Mamou on New Year's Day. I was learning little terms like Bonne année, so I was happy to know how to say. I remember I also learned Laissez les bon temps rouler around that time, and some of my other friends weren't necessarily impressed with that. But I liked being able to talk French with my grandparents a little. And at Fred's and Mamou, I was dancing with somebody from Church Point, and like it happens at a bar, ran into some of the band members. Who's your daddy, boy? Who's your mama? And said, that's Dr. Gary LaFleur and Amanda. And he said, well, yeah, I played at their wedding. It was Mr. Sadie himself. That was when he was playing at Fred's. And it was one of those feelings where I thought I was a stranger at that bar because I didn't know anyone there. But like the old people knew who I was because that's just how it is when you live in a community like that. And I'm glad I did that before I went to Baton Rouge and before I left the state. I was lucky to have been at LSUE for a little while and started to understand my Cajun roots a little bit better, like as an adult.
Definitely. And what do you think? That's one of the things I think is so unique about Louisiana is that strong sense of community. But it does seem that, do you feel like it's declined to some extent? Because I just watch these documentaries, like I guess the Les Blink documentaries and things like that. And you see all the little dance halls in the prairie.
Yeah.
And so many of them have closed. A lot of the small towns that you go to, the main street, it's kind of locked up and there's not as many active businesses.
Yeah.
And so have you seen that change, or what do you think has happened there?
Yeah, it's definitely happening. Even, I still go to Fred's. In Eunice, it's a little bit like a test. If you're kind of interested in someone romantically, from another town, is you bring them to Fred's, and if they can kind of handle it, then that's usually a good sign. Because some people are like, well, I don't get it. Back then in the 80s, you go to Fred's and there was just a few strangers from outside and you were mostly dancing with the old Mamou people. And now it's almost all full of strangers. So it's become a little more touristy rather than being the place where Mamou people go. It's a little about what you're talking about. But, what you're talking about is kind of like the culture. What we're having happen here in South Louisiana, South of Houma, is even more like community collapse. It's even more harrowing. Like in the little towns in the prairie, they still have their schools and their grocery stores, and maybe the communities aren't quite as cohesive. I kind of agree with you on that. But man, south of here, they're in danger of really losing their community. So that makes me worried and kind of sad.
Right. And then on the economic side of it too is just, well, that's something I've noticed a little bit is what you're talking about, where it's this weird thing where Louisiana culture and Cajun culture seems like it's never been this popular and well known internationally. But then at the same time, many of the towns that originated the culture, many kids like in my generation, I have so many friends that either left, whether it's Dulac down here or like Ville Platte up there, to move to a bigger city, or just had to leave Louisiana altogether for jobs. What have you seen? What were people doing? Like, what did your parents do for work? What were other kids' parents doing for work back then? And have those careers declined in the prairie?
Yeah, I was born in the '60s, so it means I kind of grew up in the '70s when the oil boom was happening. And even though Eunice is not right on the coast, Eunice had a lot of oil business, like servicing the oil business. And so it was real tempting to not go to college back then. Or I can remember when I was graduating from high school, everyone said, man, you got to be a mud engineer. I knew a few people who became mud engineers, and after about 10 years, people were not becoming mud engineers anymore. But I didn't have a problem with that. But that led to, there was like a boom of wealth, right? And then the oil bust happened. And that was in the 80s, and that hurt a lot. So I mean, I see some of the changes that you're talking about, but I guess probably the long term lesson is it goes like this. Maybe you got to expect change, and so even though it seems like there's a lot of signs of problems in the future for South Louisiana, if you can just ride out the change, sometimes new business opportunities come back. So I'm not saying that we have to pull away from the coast. There's always going to be work on the coast, whether it's wind or still oil and gas or development in other ways, getting into the Gulf. I mean, that's we're at the edge there, and that there should always be some commerce going on there.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that's what's interesting about Louisiana, our challenge of we're this crossroads with the oil and gas, with the trade and the ports and everything. And then, but we still do, we still have significant poverty, et cetera. But I'm a Louisiana optimist too, so I think I have hope. But then going back to growing up and Cajun culture, French culture, when did what you said about Dennis McGee I thought was very funny because that's what I find a lot, for example, with what we do of trying to interview people either in French or about the culture. At first people, it's a lot of times just normal people, you know what I mean? Like just people's mamas and stuff. And they think it's odd that we want to interview them because they take for granted that they speak the French. And so have you noticed that change from growing up, like you probably just took for granted. When did you realize that it wasn't like in other parts of the United States, the mamas and papas weren't speaking French, that it was so unique?
It kind of happens when you get to Baton Rouge. And it's kind of odd because in Eunice, I was a city boy because I knew real farm boys. Those are my friends, the Browns. They grew up on a farm, so they could hunt in the morning and still go to school. And I lived in the city on a city block. But then when I got to Baton Rouge, they all acted like I was a country boy, which I kind of liked that, but I knew better. I was no country boy. But that was where you start to see, we grew up in a slightly different way. Baton Rouge has a French name. I mean, I didn't know that many people from Baton Rouge. I didn't expect them to not be that French over there,
right.
But it feels like another state when you get there. And a lot of us have the same little problem. It happens when you're with a girl from Baton Rouge and you come to the parking lot and you say, "Oh, you want to get down?" And that's what we say when you get out of the car in Eunice. And in Basile and Mamou, you say, "Hey, you want to get down?" It's from the old carriage days. And they always look at you like, right here? I mean, they think talking about being romantic, it's so silly. I've heard it over and over again from Cajun people. They make that little faux pas.
Definitely. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting is how the culture, obviously the language is an integral part of the culture, but then the language has kind of seeped into other parts. And so even when people speak English, people's accents here really, I find, are just the French accenting their English. Like even the people that don't speak French, in a way, carry the French with them constantly because the accents are so strong.
Right.
And so I was wondering, growing up, what were the other things that were first of all, when did you find out that you were Cajun? That's a whole debate now, the identity. Mm-hmm. Was that a thing that you guys identified with strongly? And then is it just as soon as you're a kid, you're like, oh, we're Cajun and that means that we're different? Or what was that process like?
I could tell that my grandparents didn't talk about it the way that my parents did.
Got it.
And because it was it was a little bit like being a fish and not realizing you're in the water, like from my grandparents, right? Yeah, that was. They didn't even say I'm Cajun. They just said we're French,
right?
But like I felt it when I went to tennis camp in Texas, and me and my cousins did this, and all of a sudden we got these T-shirts that said Cajun Power. That was about like '72. I've seen there's a bunch of photos that comes up again, maybe in some Rodrigue paintings. Cajun Power, a hand holding a crawfish. It was coming out of Lafayette, But so we would go to Lafayette when we would go shopping. And it struck me as something weird, like that's around the time when my mom probably introduced me to the fact that we're going to Texas. We want them to know that you're Cajuns, and so I started to realize that we were doing something different than they were doing in other places. And the thing that was probably the most Cajun thing in my life was when I would go spend the night at my grandparents, and I realized pretty soon that not everybody's grandparents were so stoked in French like mine were, but to me, like the evidence was, I would wake up in the morning and I would hear them talking French to each other in the kitchen. It was just when there was no one else in the house, they spoke French to each other. So I feel lucky to have heard that, even though they didn't exactly teach it to me. And my maman would, this is my maman Pearl LaFleur, she would say sweet things to me in French. Like what she would say is, "Chat tu viens chien. You're like a little ugly dog." You know, there's something about nobody loves a dog like a little ugly dog. That's the kind you love the most. And she would say little things to me like that. Or when we would wake up, she would say, "Okay, I don't even know what this word is in French really, but she said, you're gonna take a little pause after you wake up. You go back into bed and you have a little second nap while he's still in your PJs or something." I don't know. Those were some sweet things that I got from my grandparents.
It's beautiful. It's really a poetic language in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what the other thing I wanted to ask is, so there's a lot of talk. I don't know if you see these debates on the internet. You probably have more important things to do, but about the whole I-10 being a divider, which is obviously is I was going to say BS, but because obviously that's a huge part of Cajun country is right above I-10.
Yeah.
But right above there is a bit of a divider, even in Ville Platte. I remember I met someone from Ville Platte, not in Ville Platte, in Evangeline Parish, I mean. And someone told me, "Oh, they're from Evangeline Parish." And I said, "Oh, well, you must be super Cajun, whatever." And they were like, "No, we're from Turkey Creek."
Yeah.
And so did you notice that growing up, just even a few miles north, the culture could change?
In Eunice, you would find that we'd have to drive through Turkey Creek on the way to Alexandria. And when you stopped at the gas station, it kind of surprised you. Oh, they talk different up here. And by the time you're in high school, you hear the little jokes like the differences between Pine Prairie and Turkey Creek. Boom, you've hit North Louisiana in our book. Yeah, so that difference was kind of palpable. And I teach at Nicholls, and so I often I introduce myself to them, and I have to define the Cajun Triangle to them. I remind them that Thibodaux is in part of that triangle, and so is Lake Charles. But the top goes almost to Alexandria, like Marksville is usually what I say is up there. That's real still Cajun Triangle, and there's some people above I-10 that are definitely Cajun, because my classroom is full of Terrebonne and Lafourche people, and they think that same thing. Above I-10 must be not Cajun. Right. That's okay. That just means they didn't visit there yet.
Right.
I get that. Yeah.
And that's also a Bayou Cajun versus Prairie Cajun thing a little bit. I feel
True.
like a lot of the Lafayette area people are not as aware of sometimes, or north of that, are not as aware of down here. And then sometimes my friends from down here don't realize how Cajun really is out, in the prairie too. So have you noticed some differences? I mean, other than just the geography between Prairie Cajuns and Bayou Cajuns, so to speak?
Because I grew up in Eunice, I love the look of a rice field. And around here, the sugarcane grows so high, it makes me feel claustrophobic. I can't see over the grass. It's like being underneath the crop. Right? That kind of bothers me. And it's really nice to be in Thibodaux at Nicholls, because I get to hear the slight little different accents from Lafourche and Terrebonne, and even different little parts of Terrebonne. And so I can kind of tell that difference, and that's, there's certain words that they use that are different. So I like hearing that. But, what we can tell almost like culturally is that dancing to Cajun music somehow was preserved in the Lafayette area. And we play Cajun music in Thibodaux. We have these Cajun jams. And man, it's hard to get the college students to dance. It's weird how they lost that here. I think it had to do a little bit with being so close to New Orleans, and so there was kind of like some modernization or something. But there's still some old time Cajun music that comes from south parts of Lafourche and south parts of Terrebonne, and they still speak French in their families at their houses and stuff. So that was kind of preserved, but there was something about they lost the dance. And it's hard to make that cool, right? I dance with people at our Cajun jams, but I'm just an old guy dancing. And every now and then we'll plant the seed in like a sorority or a fraternity, and we get a few young people dancing. But if you have to learn it on the dance floor, that's too embarrassing in a way. So I don't know. I wish we could get that going again.
Definitely.
That's one of the differences between the wetlands Cajuns and
Right.
the prairie. That's not the one in the books. What it's supposed to be about is the culture. We're connected maybe to the water a little bit more around Lafourche than they are, and then prairie Cajuns. But that's where I see it. In the prairie, they still pock eggs and they dance on the dance floor, and they don't do that in the east.
No, that was one of the things I was going to ask. I've definitely noticed it. Because when you ask people, I grew up in New Orleans, and there's so many people in New Orleans that are from, or especially on the West Bank, but in general, that are from Lafourche and Terrebonne. And so for me, learning from them, Cajun was the language, of course, but then also like boats and shrimping, and then even stuff like duck carving and things like that.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until later that I started going to Lafayette and stuff where the music was like, for them, it's fascinating to me in the Lafayette area where even people that are not musicians know how to dance. Like when you go to like Festival Acadiana or something like that, and literally just everybody,
Yeah.
the lawyers, the doctors, whatever, the engineers, they're all Cajun dancing like perfectly.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to ask you about is in the prairie, y'all are also known, now it's become quite well or somewhat well known as the Mardi Gras celebrations being different.
Yeah.
Did y'all do that growing up, or what was it like back then?
I feel kind of privileged to have seen the change. So it's pretty weird. Like I tell you, in Eunice, I grew up like a city boy. So I was in school on Mardi Gras Day at our little St. Edmunds Elementary School, like in around third grade. And I remember hearing a racket like 2 blocks away. And we were all in school on Mardi Gras. They never do that anymore. Right. We're in school, and the teacher said, "Oh, don't pay attention to that." It was just about 30 people kind of walking down the road, making a ruckus, kind of a shoddy-voddy going on. And that was the country people. They were doing their Mardi Gras. They didn't care about school. They were doing it. And it was still being beaten out of the culture for us. But by the time I was in high school, started realizing, going to Mamou and seeing that Mardi Gras, we need to be doing that. And so I kind of missed, it kind of blew up in Eunice, and it got to be a real big thing in Eunice, but that was after I left to go to college. So I missed that kind of like resurgence, but I would visit it. Once I was in other states, I would come back, and I was real happy to see that. And I got to ride in the Mamou Mardi Gras and on a horse, and so that was around 1995. So I was happy to get that done before I got to be too old for that.
Right. It seems like it's been part of the whole revitalization. That's why I think I'm always grateful, even the fact that I speak French a little bit. It's because of, and so many of the people I work with in the younger generation, it's because of that early like Cajun power, Cajun revitalization, Cajun Creole too. In the 70s, that kind of, it was declining, and in the 80s, I guess too.
Yeah.
But then they got it back into the schools and everything.
Yeah.
And so one thing I was going to ask is, what about now there's a big, I wouldn't say debate, but sometimes there are Cajun Creole debates. And so what was it like in the prairie? I know there's a lot of famous Creole families from up there too, like the Delafosses and stuff like that. And so growing up, were you conscious of there were Cajuns and there were Creoles, or what was that dynamic like?
It didn't quite occur to me until I was a little bit older. But, the LaFleurs, like I said, came from Prairie Rome. But my grandmother, she was a Fontenot, and her mom was a Veillon. And so they came from Dural.
Right.
And their little homestead was right next to Ronce-Prien-Noir, where Boissec was from. And my grandmother, Pearl Fontenot, grew up with Boissec like a playmate. Boissec worked for my old uncle. That was Nonc-Alfed Veillon. So the saying goes that Nonc-Alfed is the one who gave Boissec his name. He was kind of being mean to him at the time, because all the other workers in the field, they came in all wet because there was a big rainstorm, and Wasek was all dry, kind of leaning up against the barn. And my uncle Alfred, he's my great uncle, he was like, well, you look at you like a dry stick over there in the corner. Like he knew he wasn't out in the field. So those people were Creoles.
Right.
But my grandmother would never explain that to me. She just said she grew up knowing Boisec as a little boy. And now I see documentaries about Once Puenois, and it pulls at my heartstrings. I mean, that's very special. But I can't say that I grew up understanding that difference very well at all.
Right. It's kind of one of those things that's just part of your environment and you take for granted.
Right. Yeah, I had to kind of leave in order to understand it, I think.
Mm-hmm. And what was leaving Louisiana like?
Well, on one hand, I loved the big adventure. I didn't really want to leave Louisiana, but I did want to kind of see all these other places. And growing up, being interested in marine biology, I thought all the cool marine biology was going on the West Coast of California, or in Washington where the sea otters were and whales were, or on the East Coast where whales were. And by the time I came back, the big marine biology question was happening right here in Louisiana. I mean, coastal land loss was a big story. So it made me kind of feel proud to be in a place where there was some important marine biology going on. I had never heard of coastal land loss while I was growing up in Louisiana. But then, man, when you're away, like I was in Boston one year, and when Mardi Gras Day hit, and I can remember I was in a class and I said, oh yeah, it's Mardi Gras. I had a little care package from my mom, so I was giving everybody a bead, and they said, oh yeah, that's right, y'all do. It's Mardi Gras over there in New Orleans. And I just kept having to say, Mardi Gras is not a place. Mardi Gras is a day. Why don't y'all realize this? But, it was a silly thing to be fighting about, but it really gets to you. It makes you really homesick when you're far away on Mardi Gras Day and nobody knows it. It's not a holiday. Nobody kind of cares. You might see it on the news. So I really liked the adventure of going away, but man, I could feel it. Like I could feel the want to get back home. Yeah.
I loved also the way Louisiana people are still so Louisiana when they're outside. Like for me, one of the things, because the Mardi Gras is a great example. When I was in college, there was a professor who was from Louisiana, and so he would constantly put on like he actually invited the Lost Bayou Ramblers up there.
Yeah. And
meeting one of them, and I actually did high school debate with one of the guys in the Lost Bayou Ramblers, and seeing them, and then realizing it was for a crawfish boil. And it's that moment of, and then everyone else is like, what is this? What do you do with the crawfish? Like all these northern kids are like, what is going on? And then you're like, oh, wow, right. These things that we take for granted make us unique. And so, but I wanted to talk about the marine biology side. What has been your kind of career's focus in terms of marine biology here at Nicholls?
I am interested in how females make eggs. And I learned about that in fish, but I'm also interested in other aquatic organisms like sea urchins and stuff like that. So it's a pretty cool kind of field to be in because it's like the beginning of life, And so the protein that I studied in my PhD was vitellogenin. Most people don't really know about that unless they take a reproductive class. But vitellogenin is the protein that makes yolk. So, we all grow up eating yolk. So it's something that we're all very familiar with, but you just don't know the molecular process of vitellogenin. And I was real happy to get back to Louisiana and be in a place where some of the animals were familiar to me and I could look at some of those same processes. So in my PhD, I was interested really in the inside of a fish, but by the time that I came back to Louisiana, I had kind of expanded that to really being interested in the fish's home, the whole marsh, and then the people of the marsh too, because even my teachers, some of my good teachers in marine biology, they made sure that we talked to the guy who sold the bait. The people who sell bait on all coasts, they're always kind of close to the ecology of the area. Yet they talk to people a lot every day, so they're kind of good teachers too. And I was taught by my marine biology teachers that those are good people to get to know. And like I did that in Cocodrie with Cecil Laperouse. I'm a big fan of Cecil Laperouse.
A legend, a Cocodrie legend.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could just call him like a character, or you could say he owns a grocery store, but really he's like an ambassador, right? He's like someone who talks to new people every day. He talks to them in French. Those are the people that I really cherish.
And what have you, you mentioned the coastal land loss, which is obviously a huge challenge of our time. And from your view, what were the major causes, or are the major causes of the coastal land loss that we're experiencing?
Well, when I teach it, I say the main thing is hydrologic modification. That's what you call it. And it sounds like a mistake that we made, but it's a mistake that I have to admit, I use every day. It's not, part of the story is the levees, and, you probably know all that. And the levees were made for, in a way, a good reason, and yet they had these consequences. They kind of starved the land of its sediment and its water. But even just the roads that I take, like on the way to New Orleans, I drive Highway 90, and 90 kind of acts like a levee. It cuts off the marsh on the left side from the marsh on the right side. And before 90 was there, and before the railroad track was there, the water just flowed. We call that like sheet flow. And, I wish we had it the way that it was, but we don't. And so that's left kind of a scar on the land. And it wasn't me that did that mistake, but I would like to be part of the solution to get it a little bit more like it should be. That's going to be a hard thing to do. It's a little bit like watching a barn burn. You can't really turn back time and make it the way it was, but maybe we can do things a little bit better.
And so what are some ideas on that front? Because obviously there's been a big controversial debate about the sediment diversion and all of that. And
yeah.
You don't either as it relates to that, or what else should we be doing to restore the coast rather?
I know I have good friends who helped make the coastal master plan, over its many iterations every 6 years since 2007. So I know those sediment diversions are a good way to go. That's a good plan. If you're thinking about the long-term way to make our coast more natural and to keep it alive. On the other hand, I've seen how rocks can get the job done quick. So I understand why people are attracted to putting rocks on the coast. But also as an ecologist, rocks don't really belong on the coast of Louisiana. You have to bring them in from far away. And so I do like, if we're going to restore things, in the best case scenario, it would be kind of to restore it the way Mother Nature had made it, rather than with a whole bunch of big walls. It's almost like we just continue to complicate the situation with human-made constructions. And I'm a human, but sometimes I don't trust some of our solutions that way. The sediment diversion is at least trying to act like Mother Nature would. Let water bring sand. It takes a long time to make a difference, 50 to 100 years, but if you get started early, then maybe it'll make that difference.
And do you have any other, I guess, kind of pie in the sky or innovative or different ideas that you think should be looked more into that are not really being considered right now as much?
I like that story in the Game of Thrones. In the Game of Thrones, they had the ice wall, and somebody built that 5,000 years ago in their story because they were afraid of the White Walkers. And to me, it's that kind of long-term thinking. Like, we know well that the Mississippi, it's been doing this for 7,000 years. It went towards Sycamore Point, then it went towards St. Bernard, then it went to Bayou Lafourche, and a few other places in between, and then it went to Venice, Louisiana, where it is now. And the way it's probably supposed to move again. Maybe the way it would move would be towards Morgan City again. And it seems like we did such a great job of engineering the old river control structure. That was a hard thing to do. that was an engineering feat. It seems like we could come up with an engineering feat that would allow a shifting of the river. Now, I'm not the one, I didn't come up with that idea by any means, but that's kind of radical because it means it would change people's lives. But if you think about it over like 500 or 1,000 years, that's what we should plan for. But no politicians want to make that argument because they're going to be dead, right? So it's kind of like it doesn't fit into politics the right way. But that is my pie in the sky feeling, that we should try to let the river move where it would want to move. We can kind of control it, but it would be more natural if we did that.
Definitely. I love that idea. I mean, I think because we need some radical solutions because the situation is pretty grave. You know what I mean? Especially you talk a lot of these interviews that I do. I talk to people like in Puenochen. I'll be interviewing someone. They'll be like, "Oh, behind my house, that used to be a field with cows, and then now it's just a little bit of land before it's the open Gulf."
Yeah.
And so kind of similarly, I wanted to ask you, what is your vision more kind of economically, community culture wise? Because of the coast, but then also because of economically, the oil, there's less jobs in oil and everything. A lot of people are being pushed out of, like you said, these communities down the bayou. What is your vision or what is your dream about how could living in Dulac or in Puenochen or in Golden Meadow be viable and robust and dynamic for future generations? Whether it's economically, culturally, et cetera.
Well, we still need like the fisheries. And so, you can't really have your shrimp boat in Thibodaux. It still pays to be near the environment. But it's like we have to come up with a better way to do it. Having everybody having their house 17 feet up in the air, I mean, that's one way to do it. It seems kind of extreme when everyone has to live that high. It seems like we're kind of fighting Mother Nature. And so, I mean, that's the other reason why there's almost like there's some hope, maybe some optimism that's something that we can grow by living on the coast. Like I'm at Nicholls and we think, well, Nicholls could be one of those hubs of new ideas of how to live on the coast in a new age. That can be fruitful for idea people, but I can't say that I really know the answer. I am attracted to living in a houseboat. I think it's easier to visit a houseboat than to really own it because it's real easy for the houseboat to start sinking. I've seen it happen over and over again. Yeah, that sounds like a cool way to live in the future in houseboats, but I don't know. That's maybe that's unrealistic.
No, but I like the idea because I mean I think it just relates to how to make it work. We need to figure out how we can, live with one of our greatest assets, which is the coast, the water, the river, and the fisheries. So
yeah,
I think it's good to be a dreamer.
It would be better to live in tune with the environment rather than kind of force our will on it.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, well, this was great. We could talk for hours. I would love to talk to you again in the future. But thank you so much. It's really an honor for us, and you're kind of a legend in keeping the culture alive in Louisiana, but especially in this region. Yeah. So,
well, you're kind of a legend too. So
little by little.
Yeah, we're all doing our part, maybe.
It takes a village.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, merci beaucoup. Thank you. We appreciate it.
It was great.